Have you ever wondered how your own biases and perceptions subtly shape your chiropractic practice and your interaction with your practice members, the people you serve? Would you like to discover the untapped potential of self-awareness in this latest episode? Hi, I'm Greg Venning. Welcome to the Questing Chiropractor, where we help you make sense of the chiropractic world so that you can do what makes your heart sing, you can structure your flow, you can change the world one person at a time, and you can enjoy the wealth of the profit that can come from that. And we're excited to bring you a conversation that's as enlightening as it is engaging today. We're with Nimrod Mueller in this beautiful conversation today, and we're going to unravel the complex dance between logic and the human touch in your chiropractic practice. We're going to challenge the idea of pure objectivity and invite the listeners to explore a world where understanding and connection with the people you serve goes beyond the physical adjustments. It's a journey of discovery, of introspection and enlightenment, and we offer valuable insights for both seasoned practitioners and those new to the field. So if you're curious about enhancing your practice, building deeper connections with your people you serve, and exploring the untapped potentials that lie within the realms of perception and communication, then this episode is for you. So tune in. Welcome to the Questing Chiropractor podcast. We help you grow as visionary, vital, and capable chiropractors who are always on. We do things differently as we help to elegantly awaken your innate wisdom within. We help you create robust, predictable, and trustworthy practices that serve oceans of people and yet still have free time for yourselves and your families. We use neuroscience to deliver better business results so that you can get greater, deeper, and more effective impact in more ways. We are Questing Chiropractors, and this is our story. Welcome back to the Questing Chiropractor, and we have Nimrod Mueller with us today. Nimrod, welcome back to the podcast. So good to have you.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure and honor and fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I've so enjoyed our previous conversation. So this one today, listeners, while you're listening to this, if you're wondering how long this is going to go on, while we're recording this, Nimrod and I don't have any idea. We are purely here to play and explore some concepts and ideas. So I'm very keen to see where this goes, and I'm unattached to the outcome.
Absolutely. That's how we play in practice, isn't it?
Completely. And it's an idealized way. And I hope that we do that more in practice, actually. And that really does lead us into the idea of what we're talking about today, of using logic and reason. And if you have any draw into the world of studying the philosophy of chiropractic, we'd be calling that the critical rationalism component. If you're familiar with the innate model, we're leaning heavily into the strengths of quadrant 2, that place we call the nurture space. And so Nimrod, if we're talking about reason and logic, it applies to one of the questing chiropractors listening to this. What's a useful space to start, to lead into this, to figure out what it is? How do I apply it? What do I do about it? Where would you jump onto that boat?
You situated reasoning within quadrant 2, and maybe I would start by arguing against that and giving my reasons for it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
So, if you look at the word reasoning, then it has two usages, really. One is to give a reason as in a justification for doing something. And, it could be something that makes sense or doesn't make sense at all. And then the other one is to try and justify in a logical way in which the other person can truly understand what it is that you're doing. And so I think, both of those start with this idea that we want to share understanding and thought as well, and that rationality that I'm sure we'll get into a lot. And maybe that starts with, what is my purpose for doing this? So that's a very quadrant 1 space, right?
Yes, gotcha. Okay. So it definitely starts off in that place of what's the purpose, to what end, why.
Yeah. And then if we look at reasoning as it applies to a questing chiropractor, then we can generally really take that right down, reduce that right down to what happens in practice in a practical, if you like, a clinical application. But it's actually more than that. It's everything that we do in practice and not just the interaction with a person for the purpose of helping them improve their state of being. So it's everything from our front desk procedures and the way that our practice looks and the aesthetics of it, all the way to absolutely the encounters we have as a chiropractor with the person in every single visit and in every single way. And so we may be tempted to think that reasoning could be reduced right down to clinical reasoning, but it's actually a lot more than that.
Okay, so it starts off in a much bigger frame. Before we get to clinical reasoning, it starts off in a much bigger frame of distilling down and, like you said, extrapolating down our purpose, our reason for doing what we do in the first place.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And so probably the most beautiful place to start with reasoning is, are your values and is your vision reasonable? As in, is it yours? Do you own it? Does it move you? Does it inspire you? Is it clarified? Is it explicit and deliberate? And can you then, as you said, extrapolate it to everything that you do? Now, I know we're not going to talk about vision, we're not going to talk about values, and we won't go down that rabbit hole, but I think it's important to contextualize, because otherwise we can trip ourselves up.
Gotcha. And it's the unexplored purpose that ends up really hamstringing so many people. And I've certainly experienced that. And where that leads us into contradictions that have been unexplored, and that really leads us to stuck places. And that's where reason has a superpower. So the reason can actually draw us up to the space because it helps us to find out where we're stuck. And then we figure out, oh, we're stuck because we haven't clarified the vision and the purpose. And like you
Yeah,
say, if it's clear and compelling, we can distill down and extrapolate down from that.
absolutely. And maybe to jump to the end of the story here, where you do see that you have contradiction that is destructive, that's pulling you back, that's causing symptoms, that's causing you to devolve in your practice, take that as feedback and use that feedback to clarify your reasoning. So, it really closes the loop in a beautiful way.
Yes, because critical rationalism is all about adapting thought to what is happening so that you can keep going. It's not about getting stuck and getting dogmatic. It's really about progress of thought and of action.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think, when we go back to your question of how does the questing chiropractor apply this, absolutely, there needs to be the conversation and exploration and fun area of play of vision and values and mission and all of that. And beyond that, when we look at the chiropractor, then I would say that it really depends on the chiropractor, because this isn't a one size fits all sort of thing. And just as an aside, I think that what we've seen since the Enlightenment is that there's been more and more and more of a push into the left brain in everything that we do. And that's that quadrant two. Quadrant two thrives. That's literally where it is. And, they think that they know it all, or they can find out about it all, or they can learn it all, and they can repeat it all and regurgitate it all. And there's rules to life to be discovered. And once you discover them, you just follow them. That's left brain on its having a trip. And that's brought us some amazing successes all the way since Enlightenment, for sure, through industrialization and now in the information age and postmodernism that we're in now. And we need to remember that the left brain is not about values and meaning and depth and connection. And so when we look at, will we apply this reasoning in a justified, clarified, rational way, that's very useful. And it's also very useful to bring in the other quadrants and the other areas of life that will make it fulfilling and meaningful. That stuff that our world has pushed into such critical rationalism at the cost of values and meaning and interpersonal space and my own depth and my own exploration, my own ability to, even as a chiropractor, go back to what led B.J. Palmer on this path, which was introspection first before clinical rationalism. So there's a beauty to be added to that super strict singular focus of critical rationalism.
And so we even find that codified in the idea of evidence-based practice, where it has the person who's in front of you, their values, which is very right brain values, meaning orientated by its very definition, and then the practitioner's experience as two of the three legs before we talk about the idea of literature being important, and it absolutely is. So even within that thing of evidence-based medicine that tends to get thrown around as a very left brain phenomenon of flowcharts, diagrams, and what is abstract and printed on a page is more real. That's what's in front of you. That's not really how it was originally designed or how it's codified. It's codified to bring that right brain perspective into it and to actually hold that as two out of the three legs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a great reminder, because I think that so often we forget that all of this is contextual. And that means, who am I as a practitioner? Who is this person sitting in front of me right now as a human being? And what is the evidence that I can gather together with my experience? So, really using all of that. And I would still say that that misses a lot of the value and the depth of introspection, interpersonal meaning making, and all of that. It's almost a codified way to try and bring in these other elements or quadrants. It's quite algorithmic in itself, and it's important to remind us that those other legs are important. And the reason they're important is because we have a human being sitting in front of us. And so it's not just a number on a page. It's not just a statistic that we think we can apply. It's not just a point in an algorithm. And so it's really begs us to remember the values, the meaning, the interpersonal space, the introspection, the shared, even the creativity and the intuition that we may get or they may get are super important as part of this whole encounter that we have.
Yeah. So let's dig into this part of the encounter and how we will use this, or not use it, how we'll operate in some of this way when we're with our practice members, and helping them to critically assess their own beliefs and rules in life through asking questions, and again, open questions that are not dictated to a specific outcome. We're not doing a Socratic method of trying to hedge someone into a corner in this. And one of the examples we've used in a previous podcast is allowing somebody to explore what symptoms are and whether they're good or whether they're bad, and whether it's that simple and whether it isn't. If somebody's listening to this and they're going, great, that sounds interesting, how would I use it in practice? What's a way or an example, maybe using the same one or using a different one, where we could harness this reason and critical rationalism in a very human way in having conversations with our practice members?
I think that when we look at what that means in the encounter in practice, gosh, there's so much in that. So I think that first of all, it's about honoring the fact that I'm a human being and this is a human being in front of me, and each interaction and each moment in time is unique. And so it asks us to be open-minded and creative and not judgmental, and also at the same time as that, as not bringing in any of our biases as much as possible, and coming back to that purpose that we have, and not going into quadrant one now, but why am I wanting to help this person in a way that also asks the question, what is it that I can deliver through my unique gifts as a chiropractor? Because I think that really helps us start to become critical of our own thought. Am I here to find a diagnosis? Or am I here to find a subluxation? Or am I here to try and understand the worldview of the human being sitting in front of me? And there we can start to use some really nuanced critical thinking that allows us to have a look at, what biases am I bringing forth? Am I being objective? Am I being accurate? How do I go about this problems thinking? What sort of ethical and moral thoughts do I have in order to help this? If I am looking for an analysis, an assessment, or a diagnosis, what sort of errors could there be? What other thoughts could there be around this? And obviously, what do I need to do to arrive at a certain level of clarity and confidence around what it is that I offer to this person in front of me. And then to complete that loop, what's the feedback and reflection? So all of those things that I mentioned are really components of critical thinking. And it asks us to step back and look at our process and say, is this good enough for where I want to go?
And I like that ending. I was recently reading some precepts in law in South Africa on in the world of medical legal interventions, and one of the tests that they apply in law was not that they don't expect the practitioner to do the ideal thing at every moment. It's, is it good enough for now based on the information that I have? So there's no call to be perfect at every moment,
Mm,
every time. And I think
mm,
that what you started with was starting with a frame of curiosity and open curiosity, and and asking yourself what would be a useful question to ask this person at this moment. And so it doesn't have to be the perfect question. It doesn't even have to be a good question. Because I think
mm,
sometimes we kind of, we clam up and we shut down. And if we're trying to do what you might call on point table talk, I think some people get stuck in not knowing what to say or having an agenda too much, and then kind
mm.
of clam up and they just talk about the weather, or the table talk kind of drifts away from a place that could be more meaningful, more powerful, more transformational, where a useful question can take you in so many beautiful directions based on your precepts and their precepts and how those two intermingle and explore and discover each other through a really open and inquiring space on behalf of you as the practitioner.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if we look at rationality, reasoning, logic, thought, and that critical thinking, a lot of it really does ask us to start with clarity. And that clarity is around everything we do. And again, I don't want to go into the quadrant oneness of what we're talking about, and it's important to direct us correctly. And so if we look at clarity, maybe asking the chiropractor to sit back and to say, can you very clearly explain your understanding of chiropractic, of the concept of innate intelligence, of universal intelligence and its application in chiropractic care, of the subluxation and of the adjustment, these key terms? And can you do that in a way that your ideal person is going to, your avatar, if you like, is going to understand that, and then maybe left and right of the avatar as well, because the way that you would explain universal intelligence to a 35-year-old engineering woman is very different to how you would explain it to her 3-year-old child, or to her 80-year-old writer dad or musician. It's very different. And so even starting with clarity, which is where critical thinking, reasoning, logic asks us to start, should be applied in different ways. And from there we can go to, well, what is that logic? So then how do you make those logical connections between these key principles and the person sitting in front of you in a way that is reasonable, that helps them understand what it is that you would love to help them improve in their life? What assumptions are you bringing to that about your belief, about their belief, especially? Because those assumptions are huge. That we think we understand the person in front of us, and we never really can. What assumptions are you making about the situations? And then we could look at the application, the ethics, the challenges, the controversies. All of that is packaged into critical thinking. So it's a lot.
It is big. And one of the places, from my experience, that I've really embraced bringing this into practice over the years is asking yourself, like, where am I wrong? And like you just brought up there, the idea of assumptions. What assumptions am I making? Where am I wrong? And that very empirical process of falsification in science can get really brought in. And it's not about looking for what's bad. There's no judgment on that, because it's seen as progress to find out where I'm unclear or incorrect. And and very, very, very rarely is it absolutely incorrect. More often it's shades, and just finding out where things are unclear. But where am I wrong? And because that's where I learn the most. I don't
Mm,
learn from my bias of finding where I'm right all the time. I
mm,
learn from pushing the boundaries of my bias from where I'm wrong far
mm,
more powerfully.
mm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's such a brilliant inquiring mind question. And maybe as well as where am I wrong, we could ask what else could be true.
Yeah.
and challenging ourselves, to come up with 3 or 4 ridiculous alternatives. It's amazing how we take these basic facts for granted and don't challenge them. If I asked you to go to the Eastern Cape and look at the water first thing in the morning while it's still dark and then it gets lighter, what would you be describing there?
I'd be describing the sun coming up at a dark color sea, dark blue, black, rising into different colors as the sun came
Mm.
up, depending on whether there's cloud or no cloud.
Yeah. So let's assume it's a beautiful day and you see those changes that you just said and the sun coming up, the sun rising. Does the sun rise?
Yes. So
Really?
that, well, no. So I'm saying yes, as in I'm loving the idea of embracing that. Um, and it was Bucky Fuller. I can't remember the terms he used. Buckminster Fuller used different terms. He didn't talk about sunrise and sunset because he claimed
Right.
that as an evident fact that the sun does not rise and set. It's the earth that moves, and
Mm.
he wanted to be clear of that in his head and not fool himself and have this broad view of the universe in his everyday encounters.
Nice, nice. Yeah, yeah. And obviously, it's that's pretty trivial. I mean, does it really matter if we say one thing or the other? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what are the assumptions we're making in practice that we haven't actually explored for ourselves and clarified? And as you said, where could I be wrong, or what else could be possibly be true in
Hmm.
this scenario? And that's actually something that I've used for many, many years. And it's actually helped me when my rational thought shuts down and I go into threat. That I challenge myself in a moment like that to stop, breathe, and think what else could be true and what could be wrong about my assumption here. And often finds that those ridiculous options and alternatives may possibly be more true than the threat that I perceive I'm under.
Yeah. Yeah. So often the stories that play out in our head are nowhere close to the realities of what happens. And a classic one we feel with this in practice is if somebody phones up and says they're not coming in anymore or just stops coming in and stops answering, and we say, "What did I do wrong?" And you realize most of the time it had absolutely nothing to do with you. What else could be true at this time? They might have had a death. They might have had something better happen. They might have, there's so many different possibilities that are far more that are possible and far more probable than you, the center of your universe, having affected them, where we realize there's much more at play. And taking ourselves out of the center of the universe is a
Mm.
good place to start.
Yeah, and again, that little hint could be a hint of a small little destruction, a small little contradiction that begs us to go back, step back, and be more rational about what we're doing. So to look at it through that lens of reasoning and reasonableness and thinking well through this. I want to jump off on a topic that you just meant, or we both maybe just mentioned there, which is how our perceptions can be wrong. And I think this is a really interesting part of thinking well, reasoning, clinical reasoning, critical thinking, whatever you want to call it. Because every single idea around thinking relies on our perceptions.
Yep.
Perceptions of the information coming in, perceptions of the analysis of the data, and perceptions of the communication I'm making and how well that landed to create actions. There are perceptions every single step of the way. And so some thinkers about thinking argue that it can be totally objective. And I think that that is their perception.
Yeah, and so there's often kind of two steps in that I see that we mix up, and both of these two I see as subjective. So the first one is observation, and you might say the observation is what is the data I am receiving, either a visual, auditory, usually from our senses, and the second is what evaluation am I ascribing to that observation. Now, you might say the observation is the more objective of that, and the evaluation is the more subjective. However, what we know neuroscientifically, as and never mind philosophically, as a fact, is even the observation is filtered through our past experiences, what's happened, what our biases are, what our beliefs are. So a pure observation can be thought to actually not even exist in the first place, and even that's just a perception.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know this, through, quantum physics and mechanics, and even into a lot of the introspective work that is required beyond our empirical evidence. So we understand that in empiricism itself, there is subjectivity, and there is a lot of perception that can be applied beyond empirical data. So I struggle to see how anything can be purely objective. I know that this is something that is quite a big philosophical debate, and I don't
Yeah.
mean for us to go down there. I think it just invites us to keep an open mind.
Yeah. And I like the idea of if we're ever in doubt about that, one of the good definitions of the idea of objective is intersubjectively testable. And this is part of critical rationalism is peer support and review where necessary. Where are we asking for help? Where we don't have clarity or we don't have enough confidence in something is where we become an island and we isolate ourselves and we don't reach out for help is usually the time where we stop making progress on a path of development and ascension in our own lives and certainly within our practice. So the value of asking for help is really baked into the system because no thinker on their own can can perceive multiple perceptions and enough multiple perceptions to really stress test these ideas and then, like you say, ask the questions and then test them as we go and adapt our thought as we go through it if we're trying to do it on our own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's very, very well recognized. It's actually part of the scientific process, isn't it?
Mm,
To make sure that it is tested by others and confirmed or denied. And it's equally true in things that may traditionally look like they're beyond science. So things like meditative experiences, intuition experiences, even the quantum physics stuff that we can't see with our eyes or feel with our fingers. It requires a certain level of expertise to confirm or deny our thoughts about that. And so we should lean into that. And it also asks us to move into what is one of the last stages of critical thinking, which is to really look at what are the challenges and controversies, and how do we engage in discussions around that with peers who may hold a more expert view or even a different view to us. So if you take, if you go back to the question you had, which is how can questers apply this for themselves? Well, apply in discussion with your peers, and maybe even some peers who hold a different view to help us clarify and challenge our own ideas about universal intelligence, innate intelligence, the adjustment, the subluxation, the technique, your favorite technique, the way you communicate, all of those things to help us at least clarify and maybe even build bridges along the way.
yeah, and if we're doing this out of genuine curiosity and a very low sense of self-interest and a higher sense of service, I don't know that this can't help but be very appealing for other people to then join into and contribute to when it is genuinely done in that way, because that is a very attractive way to engage in these kind of conversations. Is to be really open to be proven wrong,
Mm.
but also just be open to having an exploratory discussion over time in a non-threatening way with genuine intellectual curiosity.
Mm. Yeah, no, you brought up a really important point earlier, which is the Socratic method is beautiful, and no one likes to feel like they've been pushed into a corner. And this curiosity for the sake of helping us understand better and improve and enrich our profession in order to leave a better legacy around us in our communities and in the world is only beneficial to everyone involved, and a really important part.
Yeah.
So I think what could be useful is going back to your question, giving a list of what entails some good reasoning and thinking. Unfortunately, not much research has been done within our profession. Actually, a lot has been done within the nursing profession. So I can just share with something. It's pretty quick. It's something
Yeah.
I always taught the students about this. That they analyzed thousands of nurses from all different countries around the world around clinical reasoning. And obviously, a lot of nurses work in an emergency setting, which is different to chiropractic, but some other parts of what they do is quite similar. They do differ in one thing, which is, especially from a vitalistic chiropractic perspective, nurses need to diagnose. And chiropractors, I think that's an interesting topic in itself that we could explore. But let's just assume that we don't diagnose at this point. But what they found was that the nurses who engaged in good reasoning, clinical reasoning, and critical thinking displayed 10 habits of their mind and 7 specific skills. So I've reordered them in the innate model, more or less. And so the habits of the mind, there's 10. It was open-mindedness, creativity, intuition, and inquisitiveness.
Yeah.
So that's quite quadrant 1. And then
Yes.
in quadrant 2, mind habits, because there'll be skills that are more quadrant 2, but the mind habits were intellectual integrity, perseverance. And then we move into quadrant 3, which is where the person in front of us sits. And there was this contextual perspective and flexibility. And then into quadrant 4, it's confidence and reflection. So that's what the nurses identified. So again, open-mindedness, creativity, intuition, inquisitiveness, intellectual integrity, perseverance, contextual perspective, flexibility, confidence, and reflection. I think that's quite nice for us as chiropractors.
Yeah, and there's so many similarities between the professional lived experience of a nurse, of a chiropractor, and even in the occupational therapists in their evidence, and they're looking into the nature of what they do and what kind of evidence is good and what kind of evidence isn't. They're finding similar things to what the nurses have found, and some chiropractors might be finding as well, as the RCT and the meta-analysis and the systematic review at the top of the chain is not always as useful as a case series or a case cohort. So really looking at that evidence hierarchy in some of these disciplines that have some things in common that is different from maybe the GP or the specialist or the physicist in how they might look at things is fascinating to see that coming through, these similar themes coming through from these different professions that are maybe outside the rung of the like let's call it kind of the key medic in the healthcare paradigm.
Yeah, I'm going to take a quick little 1-minute detour here, and I promise to come back. We know that the evidence-based hierarchy was developed within the allopathic industry to serve that industry, and it's their game and it's their rules. And if we want to play in their game, we have to follow their rules. And I'd love to have a podcast exploring that politics with you at a very different time. And what I will say is the case report and the case series, which is about a single human being, may not be very high on the hierarchy for the allopathic industry, but gosh, does it matter for that individual human being? Their story matters. And so when we work in a way that individualizes care and personifies it to the human being in front of us, nothing is more important than their story and their experience and their progress. And so in a way, it dissolves the medical allopathic industry hierarchy of evidence and says the most important thing is the story of the person in front of me. So that's my 1-minute detour. But what I
think that's so important, because chiropractic is this individualized science, philosophy, art, and politics of the nature of health and of life. And it is individualized to that person in front of us. And when we ignore that, when we negate that, we do it to our own detriment and the detriment of that interaction we have with that person.
Right, and I will go back to the point I made in that little detour. If we want to play within their game, we have to follow their rules, and that can be useful within politics. I'm not sure that that's useful at the individual chiropractic practice level.
And so I think, like, what I've found quite interesting is even within that allopathic model, the calls for them to start individualizing some of what they do are growing quite significantly as they're seeing the limitations of the hierarchy that they use.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
and I know that's early.
Yeah, and so, bringing this back to critical thinking, we did say that, coming back to that idea that it does apply to the human being in front of us so that it makes sense, it is reasonable to them. So I just want to finish off that It's a really interesting study and book actually about nurses. But the key skills, there were the 10
Yeah.
mind habits, and then they have 7 key skills. And these really sit a lot more within what we would refer to as quadrant 2. So it's information seeking, which, does have that quadrant oneness about it, but it is about gathering information. And remember, we just had a conversation about information is open to our perceptions and filters. So it's really important to put that there. And then it's analysis and it's discriminating. And I love this word, because it really does ask us to have a look at who are we and what are we bringing to understand that information. Then it's about logical reasoning, applying standards. And again, this may flow into politics, establishment, regulations. Where are these standards coming from? And are they actually reasonable for me? That has a moral and an ethic little tone to it. And then it moves out really beautifully. So these skills that they had then go into predicting and transforming knowledge. So all the way in from information seeking, analysis, discriminating, logical reasoning, applying standards, and then predicting and transforming knowledge. And what they showed, probably most interesting of all, is the nurses who were best at their job applied all 17, so 10 mind habits and 7 skill sets, every single decision that they made.
Holy cow.
Yeah. How amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
It would be fascinating to see how that applied to chiropractors, to us in practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So if we bring this back to what we would be doing at the coalface, talking to people, adjusting people, so really caring for people every single day, I think one of the traps we might sometimes fall into is thinking that we can purely logic people into the idea of chiropractic care, especially lifetime chiropractic care. And the lure of critical rationalism is that you can logic somebody into it, where anybody who's tried that will probably realize it doesn't work very far, or it doesn't go very far, or it takes a huge amount of energy to keep pounding that on someone, and not many people stay around for long with that. So in terms of helping to reach out as a Questing chiropractor, we want to provide the service to as many people as possible. We realize some of its value. Maybe we've logically deduced some of the precepts of chiropractic, and we're reasonably clear and confident, and we find it compelling. We've done it for ourselves. What would you say in terms of communication within a practice, specifically with the practitioner to the person in front of them that they're caring for? How would they bring this frame into practice and into that interaction?
I think the first step is a desire to be good enough and to see what that means with the person in front of me right now. So, in other words, don't copy paste from one person to the next. I think it's such a temptation with what we do to fall into that trap, and it's really begs us to remember that it's a human being and a human life in front of us. And if we go back to our purpose, that quadrant oneness of this creativity and open-mindedness, then we come into this situation being critical, which means really all of those practices that we mentioned before, looking at my biases and my assumptions and my thought process and all of that sort of thing. Am I being deductive or inductive here? But also saying, well, I'm here to help this one person see if they want to change their life in the way that I'm offering. Is what I'm offering reasonable to their worldview? And so it asks us to step into that, into what is their worldview and what could make sense from their perspective to go on this journey and collaborate together. And to go back to the points that you were just making about we can logically, rationally bash someone into a certain course of action. And we see that around us a lot, people using that and even screaming that the thought process and reason and logic is the only way to make sense of the world. And, otherwise you're practicing inferior things. To me, that's quite mechanistic. And we know mechanism works without a doubt, and it's limited in its usefulness as well. And so maybe a more beautiful application through a chiropractic lens would be from above down, inside out, from the human being's perspective. And so stepping into that and saying what makes sense, what is reasonable for this person from within their perspective of the world, and how could chiropractic care be a step forwards in their evolution and ascension for the rest of their life, or for as long as they choose. And starting with that question and that open-mindedness and creativity, feeling your intuition, your inquisitiveness around that, and then having the integrity to do what is called of you.
Yeah, that's so great. Starting from their worldview. I think that's just, if anybody's listening to this, the power of taking time to explore that person's worldview, their perception of their own health and well-being, and their perception of life. And maybe you don't ask those exact questions when you go, but you pick up clues around the edge in this clinical encounter. And when you do your history, when you do your systems review, people will leave clues in how they answer questions, how they relate to things. And they'll let you know whether they're thinking that this thing is a now thing and it's only just started now and it should go away tomorrow, or whether they see this thing as something that's come from years before, whether they see their body as interlinked, whether they see their body as discrete parts. We'll get these clues as we go through, and it starts building a picture. And the beauty of for me, the beauty of the chiropractic message, the chiropractic paradigm is it is so broad and vast that I don't know that there is a worldview that won't embrace some part of it for some time in some way, and potentially then open up to more of it for more time in more ways.
Yeah, and I think, as you just mentioned, that opening up, it's super important, because we should remember that people aren't stagnant either. So, if you look at what makes sense to a 3-year-old is different to a 7-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 17-year-old, and on from there. And so our own, logical, rational bashing may work to some people to some degree, but it certainly won't work to all people always. And I think that it's so much more fun to step into their world and see how they're making sense of their life, and invite them to see how chiropractic can collaborate with them to continue to explore and expand and ascend and evolve as they grow and develop as this beautiful human being.
And that development happens day by day for all of us as well. We are forever changed by every experience we have. I am different at the end of my interaction with you now than I am at the beginning. The person who saw you yesterday doesn't have even the same physical body, but that same person is a different person who comes to see you today. And they will be open to different things today than they were yesterday. They might be closed to different things today than they were yesterday. So I love the continual idea that we build and we serve in our practice one person at a time, one interaction at a time, and that person is new every time. The metaphor of you cannot step into the same river twice is just so applicable here. And if we think that we can relate to this person exactly the same way as we could relate to them yesterday, we'll find that people don't stay with us very long, because we're staying the same and they're changing. They're growing out of our practice. They're growing beyond us. And it really does challenge us to continue our own growth, to continue our curiosity about them, their life, their worldview, and then tailoring what we do to their values in an integritous way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, this all comes back to being rigorous in how we apply ourselves to the people in front of us, with the ethics and the morals that this sort of thinking and logic really asks us to have. And remember that those ethics and morals, we're now moving into quadrant 3 and beyond. It's the actions that I should take based on my thinking and what I've done to date, how I've looked at myself. So, that flow continues, not only as the waters of the river flow, but also as we flow through each moment and each decision rationally and logically and reasonably.
Nimrod, I think that's a beautiful point to finish off today. Clearly, this is something we could explore in many different facets going ahead, and we will in future podcasts. So I wanted to say thank you for joining us today. This has been eye-opening for me. I'm definitely a different person afterwards, and I'm sure our listeners will have sapped this up as well.
And so am I, Greg. It's always such a pleasure and just a fun game.
And to our questers, thanks so much for joining us. Remember, please consider leaving up to a 5-star review for this. Please subscribe. Your subscriptions, your reviews do really give us a lot more incentive to really push the boundaries of what we're doing within this podcast and these recordings. So please do consider either subscribing or leaving us up to a 5-star review, or doing both. And then you'll definitely be getting more from the Questing Chiropractor podcast. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Yes.
Share this with your peers, and share the conversation with your peers as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Nimrod.
Thanks, Greg.